Welcome back. Up to this point, our pivot tables have been static, which is another way of saying that other than expanding or collapsing groupings, there hasn't been any real mechanism for an end user to slice, dice, and otherwise interact with the output. But we're about to change that by adding filters to our pivot table. Filters on pivot tables work in much the same way as filters applied to ranges or Excel tables. They allow us to narrow the scope of the data we see in the pivot to zoom in on some subset of the data that we're interested in. Filtering can be applied at the report level or to individual fields within our pivot. Report level filters are what will really empower our end users to create custom cuts of the data, but we'll start with filters applied to individual fields to get us warmed up. So here in our example pivot table, let's say I wanted to filter our output to only show data pertaining to our Jacksonville, Florida site. So to do that, I need to click any row header that's at the same level of hierarchy as the Jacksonville, Florida site, which of course is the site level. So for example, I can just click my Aurora, Colorado row header here, and now I'll be able to apply filtering to that level of the hierarchy. So having selected that cell, I'll then click this filter button in the top left cell of the pivot, and now we have a filtering dialog box that's pretty much the same as the ones we've seen for Excel tables and just applying filters to ranges. So now I'll uncheck Select All and then check Jacksonville, Florida and click OK. And now the scope of our pivot has been narrowed to just data pertaining to our Jacksonville, Florida site. So what happens if I want to apply filtering to a different level of our hierarchy? For example, maybe I want to filter my output to focus on a handful of managers versus seeing all of them, but I'm not interested in applying a site level filter. Well, first I'll clear our existing filter, and then to apply a filter to the manager level of our hierarchy, I'll just click any of the row headers that contain a manager. So for example, I'll click the cell that contains the row header for Nova Harshberger. And now if I go back up to my filter button, you'll see that instead of our sites being listed, all of our managers are listed because the cell I had selected before clicking the filter button was at the manager level of the hierarchy. So now I can just randomly select a few managers to appear in the output and click OK. And now you'll see that my output has been narrowed to just those managers. Now this is one scenario where the outline layout of a pivot table can be a little bit more intuitive than this compact layout. So if I remove my filters here, and then go to Design, Report Layout, and then change my layout to be outline form, now we can apply filters to each of the fields in our rows area a little bit more intuitively. Instead of there being one filter button whose context changes depending on which level of the hierarchy you've selected in the first column, instead I have 3 filter buttons, one for each field in our rows area. So this is in fact one advantage of the outline view versus the compact view. Now this sort of filtering is fine, but it has a couple of limitations. One is that it's not terribly intuitive for a non-technical user of Excel to apply. And one of the great advantages of pivot tables is that they can be deployed as a kind of end-user tool that allows somebody without a lot of technical acumen to still quickly gain insights into their data. So to place a burden on those end users of understanding all the nuances of how to apply filters at different levels of groupings in our pivot table just doesn't make a ton of sense. And there's another problem. What if we want to filter our pivot table by a field that doesn't actually exist in the pivot table? Clearly we need another solution. So first I'm going to revert our layout back to the standard compact layout. And now let's look at a pivot table feature that allows us to filter the pivot table by fields that we haven't even included in the pivot table. These kinds of filters are called report level filters. So let's say, for example, we wanted to be able to filter this pivot table by call type. But we don't want to further clutter our pivot table layout by adding the call type field to our columns area or our rows area. The solution then is to add it as a report level filter. So to do that, I'll click anywhere inside my pivot, then go to our Pivot Table Analyze tab, and then hit my Field List button to make the field list appear. And now I'll search my field list for call type description, and then drag that down into the Filters area of the Pivot Table field list. And now you can see, above and to the left of my pivot table, there's a filter button corresponding to my call type description field. And then if I click that button, we have all the distinct values in that field. And if I choose any one of these, now all of my numbers are adjusted accordingly. So this grand total for my Aurora, Colorado site reflects the totals just for all tech support calls taken at that site versus all calls. And we're not limited to applying filters for a single value. If I click my filter button again, and then check this box next to select multiple items, now I can select any combination of the values available to me in that filter. So if I want to see all billing and sales calls but no tech support, I can just check those and click OK. And now my numbers will adjust accordingly. And just to prove to ourselves that this is working the way we hope, I'll go back to my raw data worksheet and then filter for site equals Aurora, Colorado. And then I'll filter for call type description is billing or sales. And you'll see in the status bar that 16,854 records were returned. And then if I go back to my pivot table, that's exactly the number we have reflected for Aurora, Colorado with those filters applied. Now keep in mind the advantage in terms of the layout of our pivot table to adding call type description as a filter versus including it in the actual physical pivot table layout. So if I clear the filter on call type description and then drag it from the filters area over to the columns area, we can still get to the same information, but as we saw in this layout previously, it's just kind of confusing. It's kind of busy. Now an end user of the pivot table is going to struggle to interpret what any given number here actually means in terms of all the different layers of filtering that are being applied. So if you find that you've dragged so many fields into the rows and columns area of your pivot that it's kind of hard to reason about the numbers, it might be time to pull one or more of those fields out of your main pivot table layout and convert them to filters instead. So I'll make my field list reappear, and then go ahead and move call type description back to my filters area. And now to further demonstrate the trade-off between filters versus row and column groups, I'll move our site field here, which is currently the highest level in our rows hierarchy, to the filters area. So first I'll find it in my field list, and then just drag it up under call type description in my filters. So the obvious advantage is that my primary pivot table layout is already a good bit cleaner and easier to reason about. Now the disadvantage is I don't get to see the numbers for each of my 3 sites side by side. Instead, I essentially have to page through those numbers one at a time by selecting those individual sites in my filter. But again, keep in mind that this trade-off can be more than worthwhile, especially if you want to add a large number of fields to your pivot table to slice and dice your data in different ways. While Excel will technically allow you to add as many fields to the rows and columns areas as you want, in practicality, excessively complicated layouts quickly become very difficult to interpret and reason about. But with filters, you can really add as many as you like without unduly cluttering your pivot table output. Now, one note about the types of fields that are most appropriate to use as filters. Filters work best on fields that have relatively few distinct values. So for example, our call type field, which has 3 distinct values, and our site field, which also has 3 distinct values, are good candidates to use as report level filters. But something like the date on which a call was made is probably not a good use case for a filter because there's so many possible distinct values. So instead of us seeing a list of 3 items when we click this filter button, we'd see a list of maybe hundreds or maybe even thousands of different distinct items. A field like that with so many distinct values makes more sense in the rows area of the pivot table versus as a filter. Alright, so we've already seen how filters can make our pivot tables more dynamic and user-friendly, while also keeping our layouts relatively uncluttered. But there's actually an even more powerful feature for filtering pivot tables, and that's slicers. We'll talk all about them in the next video. I'll see you then.